Zoltan Pozsar says Bretton Woods 3 has begun. I'm going to reveal how the global monetary system has changed and how it will affect you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the past system, how it worked before, and then we'll discuss how it changed about 30 days ago when Russia invaded Ukraine. Editor, let's cut to a clip of Zoltan explaining this in his own words.
One pillar of Bretton Woods 3 is that the world as we know it, where everybody is happy to export to the US, get paid in dollars, and recycle those dollars onshore or offshore in the euro-dollar market, I think that whole mechanism has been damaged. It's inevitable that change will come out of that. It's not immediate, but it's inevitable.
So what does he mean when he talks about recycling euro dollars into treasuries? Let's go to the whiteboard and explore this further. It starts with a bank in the euro dollar system. So this is a bank outside of the United States, outside of the purview of the Fed, that can actually create dollar-denominated loans. So let's say we've got Global Corp that needs to buy some oil for some chemicals that they sell to the United States, or some natural gas, something like that. Well, they need to borrow the money to do this. So they go to Euro-Dollar Bank, say, bank, we need a loan for $1 billion, let's say. So Euro-Dollar Bank says, yeah, we know you're good for it, so we'll go ahead and give you the loan. So let's start by looking at the balance sheet of Euro-Dollar Bank after the loan has been created. On the asset side, they've got the new loan. On the liability side, they have the new dollars that have been created that are an asset, for the time being, of Global Corp. Okay, so Global Corp takes those dollars and they send them over to XYZ commodity producer country. XYZ commodity producer country sends them the stuff, the natural gas they need to turn that into the chemicals that they can sell to the United States. Well, what does XYZ commodity producer do with the money? In fact, let's back up just a moment here. Let's just assume that XYZ commodity producer has an account with the same Euro-Dollar Bank. So what Euro-Dollar Bank does is just transfer the $1 billion from Global Corp's account over to XYZ commodity producer account at the same bank. This is why I've turned the dollar sign from green over to red, just to indicate that now these $1 billion are an asset of XYZ commodity producer. Just wanted to point that out because that's going to be important here in just a moment. So XYZ commodity producer now has the $1 billion as an asset on their balance sheet. Well, what do they do with the $1 billion? Well, they'll go ahead and send that over to the United States because they want to earn some form of return, a little bit of interest on their dollars. So the United States sends them treasuries. Okay, so now let's say that they've done another transaction here. So their balance sheet, they have the dollars from the other transaction, and they have the treasuries that they bought with the dollars they received from Global Corp in the first place. So let's think this through. Well, they have treasuries on their balance sheet and they have dollars. These treasuries are a liability of the US government, and the dollars are a liability of Euro-Dollar Bank that is under the control, to a certain degree, of the United States. More on that in just a moment. But it doesn't end there. What happens is the dollars circulate in the United States economy, and because the United States doesn't produce the chemicals it needs, let's say for the sake of this example, those dollars come back out and go straight over to Global Corp. Okay, well, Global Corp takes those dollars, they go onto their balance sheet or back onto their balance sheet, but they take a lot of those dollars that go over to Euro-Dollar Bank to do what? Pay down the original loan. So if the loan is being paid off, let's just say for a moment that they pay off the entire loan with this one transaction, let's say they get $1 billion from the United States for their chemical products. The $1 billion goes over to Euro-Dollar Bank to pay off the billion-dollar loan that was created in the first place. Okay, let's think through what has happened to Eurodollar Bank's balance sheet. Again, they started, after the loan was created, with a loan as an asset, with the dollars as a liability. Then those dollars went over to become an asset of XYZ commodity producer. But then what happened is Global Corp took the money, the dollars they received from selling chemicals to the United States to pay off that loan. So when the dollars were transferred over to the United States, now all of a sudden, those are no longer a liability of Eurodollar Bank. And when Global Corp pays off the loan, now all of a sudden, there's no assets and no liabilities. Stated another way, they created money to begin with, and then when the loan was paid off, the dollars or the money was destroyed. So at the beginning, the amount of dollars in aggregate total increased, and at the end, when the debt was paid off, the amount of dollars in aggregate total decreased. Now let's go over and think through some of the implications of this system. So again, Zoltan was talking about recycling Eurodollars into treasuries. So the Eurodollars were created, the commodity producer gets the Eurodollars, and then they buy treasuries. This is the recycling process he's talking about. But what does this mean for the United States and the domestic economy? Well, it dramatically lowers interest rates. Why? Because when Janet Yellen is issuing those treasuries, she has a lot more demand. More demand, price goes up, interest rates go down. And if your mortgage rate is tied to the 10-year treasury, if XYZ commodity producer is buying or willing to buy a lot more of those treasuries, that's going to reduce your mortgage rate. That's going to reduce the rate of your car loan. That's going to reduce your credit card bill. This is how it impacts the average Joe and Jane. But the story doesn't end there. If interest rates go down, then all else being equal, the aggregate demand, the purchasing power in aggregate total in the United States is going to go up. As an example, let's say that you own a home. Okay, well, if interest rates are lower, then that means there's more purchasing power, more demand for your house. The price is going to go up. That means that your net worth is going to increase. Why? Because of this system that Zoltan was talking about, where Eurodollars are created and then they're recycled into US treasuries, thanks to these commodity producing countries buying treasuries and keeping them on their balance sheet as a reserve asset. But now let's go ahead and think through the next step. If you were a country that has a lot of dollars, like the United States, just being able to print their own dollars, or Japan, who has a lot of dollars from running a trade surplus, because they're selling all of their stuff to the global countries and they're receiving dollars in return. So then they can take those dollars and buy the energy or the commodities they need, because the commodities are denominated in dollars. The commodities settle in dollars. Therefore, if you've got the dollars, then you can get the commodities or the energy you need. So the way the system worked in the past, as Luke Groman has said, and Zoltan used this phrase as well, it's our currency, meaning it's the United States currency, but it's your problem, meaning that it's our currency, but you need to have it. And you need to have it to buy X, Y, and Z. And we're going to control, to a certain degree, the value of those dollars or the value of that currency relative to the stuff that you need to buy in the future. Because if the United States is running massive fiscal deficits and they're running huge trade deficits and they're, let's just say, quote unquote, printing money and creating consumer price inflation or devaluing the dollar relative to oil, then all of those commodity producing countries that are holding dollars under their balance sheet as a reserve asset, they're all losing purchasing power. So again, another example of our currency, but your problem. And this is something the entire globe now understands and is moving away from. And it's a big component of Bretton Woods 3. Another knock-on effect to the system we had in the past, where the Eurodollars were recycled into treasuries, is it created future demand for dollars. Why? Because let's go back to the example of Eurodollar Bank creating the loan in the first place. That loan is denominated in dollars. Therefore, if Global Corp wants to pay back that loan, what do they need? Dollars. So if a loan is created in this euro-dollar bank system, or even if a loan is created in the United States, it creates future demand for dollars. So if there's more lending that's occurring or more credit that's being extended outside of the United States, that is creating artificial demand for dollars. So when those dollars leave the United States for that trade deficit, they have an increased amount of demand. If the dollar wasn't the reserve currency, and if there wasn't all this debt that was being created by the euro-dollar system, partly as a result of the commodities being priced in dollars, then when the United States exported all of those green pieces of paper, the value of the dollar would plummet. So this is why the United States, to a large degree, is able to export its inflation. Peter Schiff says this all the time, and it makes a lot of sense. When the United States creates an excessive amount of dollars domestically, those dollars can leave the United States, and it really doesn't matter. It doesn't really impact the value of the dollar relative to the imports that we need from other countries, because those dollars are either going to pay off debt, which decreases the amount of dollars, like we explained earlier, or it's sitting on the balance sheet of a commodity producer, which doesn't circulate with a lot of velocity, chasing other goods and services. So how will it impact you, the viewer watching this video right now, when we transition into this Bretton Woods 3 system, according to Zoltan? Meaning, what happens when the Eurodollar system is no longer recycling those Eurodollars into treasuries? What happens when it's no longer our currency, your problem, but it's our commodity, your problem? What happens when there's no more future demand for dollars outside of the United States, or very little, and we can't export that inflation? How will this impact you and your portfolio? We're going to discuss that more throughout the rest of this video. Step number 2, how the global monetary system is changing from what we were doing in the past to this new system Zoltan Pozsar refers to as Bretton Woods 3. So in the last step, we kind of went over the problem for these commodity producers and the commodity consumers that produce a lot of stuff. So let's just think through this from a standpoint of the individual countries. Commodity producer would be someone like Russia, commodity consumer, and a stuff producer would be someone like Japan or China. We'll stick with China because we're going to use them in the example below. But the problem they have is their assets are someone else's liability, namely the United States and the West. So the West can freeze their assets, like the money that we talked about, the dollars that are on the balance sheets of the Eurodollar banks, or the United States, to a certain degree, can devalue those assets on their balance sheet relative to the stuff that they need to buy. So if we were to summarize their two liabilities with the asset side of their balance sheet, or I guess their two biggest risks, let's put it that way, would be that the United States or the West can freeze their assets, or the United States and the West can create this devaluation of the dollar, or devaluation of some of the assets they have relative to what they need to buy in the future, which would be oil. So what's the solution they're transitioning into right now as we speak? According to Zoltan, it would be to de-dollarize. So let's think through this system if we weren't using dollars. Now, the bank in the middle would be China Bank. We'd have Global Corp. On the right, we'd have China. Remember, they're the country that is producing all of the stuff, but they are a commodity consumer. And then we have Russia, which is a commodity producer. So Global Corp this time would get a loan not denominated in dollars, but denominated in yuan, because Russia would charge yuan for the commodities that Global Corp needed to turn into the chemicals or the stuff that they were giving to China, that China uses as an input cost to create the end version of the stuff, the retail stuff, if you will, that they could go ahead and sell back to Russia. So when China buys the input stuff from Global Corp, They pay in yuan. Global Corp can take those yuan to pay down their yuan-denominated debt. But this isn't where it ends. We got to take it a few steps further here. Now, on the asset side of the balance sheet, Zoltan believes that they'll hold each other's currencies, but mostly could hold gold. And let's think through the problems they have. Freezing their assets and inflation relative to stuff that they need to buy in the future. So if they hold gold on the asset side of their balance sheet, well, that solves the freezing problem because that's no one else's liability. And to a certain degree, it solves the problem of the purchasing power of your assets being able to buy the same amount of stuff that you need in the future, the same amount of commodities, let's say. But I think there's an interesting solution for that Zoltan didn't talk about. If you went ahead and pegged oil to gold, then what would happen, as an example, is you would say, okay, we are selling X amount of barrels of oil for X amount of ounces of gold. And we're going to stick to that. And then China said, okay, well, this yuan that we're using for all these settlement payments, just to make things easy, or the transactions, we'll go ahead and peg that to a certain amount of gold. So then this solves both problems. So if Russia is holding yuan on their balance sheet, they know that's pegged to gold, and therefore the stuff that they need to buy from China in the future is going to be at the same price. And China can hold the gold on their balance sheet and know that the commodities that they need to buy in Russia in the future is also going to be at the same price. So Zoltan didn't talk about this, but that's something that my good friend Luke Groman has discussed. And I think it's an interesting thought experiment, to say the least, especially when you look at it through the lens of what Zoltan is saying with his transition into Bretton Woods 3. So just to review, to make sure we're all on the same page, we've got Global Corp taking out a loan from China Bank denominated in yuan. Then they get the commodities they need from Russia. They pay in yuan. Russia puts the yuan on their balance sheet. Global Corp turns the commodities into the chemicals, called the input stuff. They sell that to China. China pays in yuan. Global Corp takes the yuan to pay down their yuan-denominated debt. China produces the retail stuff, sends that over to Russia. Russia pays for that in yuan. And while this is happening, China is taking a lot of the yuan they're receiving, buying gold. That becomes their reserve asset. And then Russia takes a lot of the yuan, keeps it on their balance sheet because it's pegged to gold potentially. But even if they don't do that, then they take that yuan that's on their balance sheet and they buy gold. So that becomes their reserve asset that again solves the two-pronged problem of someone else's liability and purchasing power moving forward, regardless of whether you're trying to purchase commodities in the future or you may be trying to purchase stuff. So again, the liability on the balance sheet of China would be yuan. The liability on Russia's balance sheet would be the rubles. But effectively, China wouldn't really worry about the value of the ruble. That would just pertain to the domestic economy in Russia because they're not really using rubles as a reserve asset on their balance sheet. They're holding the gold. So if Russia decides to inflate away their currency, well, that's just going to decrease in value relative to the asset that China has on its balance sheet. And that asset, remember, is pegged to what they need to buy in the future, which would be oil. And the same would hold true. For China, the liability is the yuan, but Russia wouldn't care about that too much either, because remember, in the future, they could peg the yuan to gold. So that describes how the system may look in the East if we transition into Bretton Woods 3, like Zoltan is suggesting. But what happens to the West? In this interview, Zoltan goes over that as well. In fact, editor, let's go ahead and cut to a clip of Zoltan describing exactly the transition that he sees happening in the West right now.
What ended up happening, I guess unintended consequences of all this, is that the private sector is sanctioning itself because it just doesn't want to touch any commodities coming out of Russia. It doesn't want to finance anyone, moving commodities come out of Russia. If you're a ship owner, you don't want to lease your ships to anyone who wants to move stuff out of Russia. So basically, it's this self-sanctioning aspect of the private sector.
So basically what he is describing over in the West is you've got Virtue Corporation, and they are sanctioning themselves from Russia. Because the politicians, like your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, can say, well, we're sanctioning Russia except for oil. But if Virtue Corporation says, no, we're not going to buy oil from Russia, even if we can, effectively, it's like putting on the sanction. And then you've got Moody, the millennial, right here in the middle, and they don't care if their standard of living goes down, so long as it makes them feel good, or so long as whatever policy your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam is implementing against Russia or the East makes them sleep well at night. So Virtue Corporation, Moody, and your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, which would represent the politicians in Europe, pretty much all the politicians in the West, they have a plan, or let's call it a solution as well. Of course, their solution isn't to de-dollarize. They want to continue using the dollar or the euro, but they want to move towards more protectionism. And they realize that they're way too dependent, not only on the East, but maybe even too dependent on each other. And Zoltan points out that many of the politicians in Europe have talked about building up their own military so they don't have to rely on the United States. So what you'll see moving forward with the West is they will continue these policies that they pursued prior to Russia invading Ukraine, and that would be this push towards electrification with a Green New Deal. But on the other hand, they also want to be ESG friendly. So they don't want to invest in things that they need, or commodities, to make this Green New Deal a reality. So what will they do? Well, they still need to source their commodities, but they're definitely not going to do it from those bad guys in Russia. So they might just hold their nose and buy them from China. Zoltan points out what would most likely happen in this scenario, and that's the Chinese bank would just buy the commodities from Russia. They'd store them, and then they would just sell them at a huge markup to Virtue Corp or your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam in the West. And it makes Moody feel good because they believe that they're pushing back against Russia, when in reality, those commodities are still being sourced in Russia. The only difference is China is making a huge profit by buying them from Russia and then acting as a middleman, selling them over to the West. And we see this playing out right in front of our own eyes with energy costs skyrocketing, the price of food doing the exact same thing. And it's getting so bad in Europe, the politicians are actually asking them to use a lot less energy by driving less, showering less, doing fewer loads of laundry, and turning off the heat in their house, just wearing a few extra sweaters. So right now, Bretton Woods 3 in the West is all about lowering the standard of living to increase the level of good feeling. Step number 3. So what does the world look like in the future if we move to this new global monetary system Zoltan Pozsar is talking about? Well, before we get into that, I know a lot of you are probably scratching your head, or you're saying to yourself, oh, George, you don't know what you're talking about with the West. These sanctions that we're using against Russia, and maybe in the future with some of these countries that we deem unfriendly, they have a lot of teeth and they're working extremely well. Well, I'm not here to condone anything that Russia is doing. I disagree with it wholeheartedly. But that doesn't mean that sanctions work. At the end of the day, it's like fighting a professional boxer. Every single time you try to hit them, they hit you 10 times harder. And that's exactly what these sanctions are for the West. To illustrate my point, editor, let's cut straight to the internet. Okay, let's start by going to the website visualcapitalist.com. And they just came out with this kind of pictograph in March, and this is visualizing the European Union's energy dependence. So Europe's dependence on energy imports has become a major source of criticism in 2022. But is it actually cause for concern? Short answer, yes. So here is the energy dependency color scheme. It goes from the dark brown or black is 0 up to orange is 100%. So EU average is 57.5% energy dependency, meaning they have to import 57% of their energy. This is up slightly from 2000, but some countries it's up significantly. You can guess the countries, the ones that are really pushing this ESG type of narrative. So from the top here, we've got Sweden, Finland, the Scandinavian countries, 33%, 42%, Denmark, 5%, Germany, 63%, Luxembourg, 92%, France, 44%. And by the way, they're not including nuclear in this, and nuclear is a big component of France. And where do they get their uranium or the processed uranium? They're going to get that from Russia as well. Spain, 67%, Portugal, 65%, Italy, 73%, Greece, 81%. I mean, this is unbelievable when you look at it in these terms. So going down to the EU imports, okay, so they're obviously very dependent for energy on other countries. Where are they getting this energy? The crude oil, 26% from Russia. The coal would be 46% from Russia. And the natural gas would be 41% from Russia. So let's just think about this for a moment. Let's go to coal and this recent article from Zero Hedge talking about how the EU minister of the EU wants to sanction coal specifically. They're not talking about oil and natural gas yet, although, going back to step number 2, because of the virtue signaling from the corporations, effectively, they might as well have sanctions on the oil and natural gas. But just specifically looking at this through the lens of coal, let's just assume that they completely cut Russia off. You say, okay, well, that would really hurt Russia because they're not going to get that revenue. They're not going to get those dollars or those euros. Not really. Let's go over to the price of coal right now. And going back even 3 years, we can see coal was at $50. It spiked up to $350, but it's still hovering around $295 or so. Where would the close? Oh yes, at $295. So almost $300. So this would imply what? Obviously, there's far more demand than there is supply. So can we safely assume that Russia has some sort of buyer out there? I mean, let's look at China. They might have to sell to them at a discount, but someone out there is going to be more than willing to buy this coal that Russia would have sold to, let's say, Germany. So this pictograph illustrates perfectly how these sanctions don't have that much of a negative impact on Russia, but they have a tremendous negative impact on the poor and middle class of the West, most specifically Europe. And this is why I've said throughout this video that the policies employed by the West really have an extreme cost, but very little to no benefit other than just making us feel good because we're, quote unquote, doing something, even if the result of what we're doing is the opposite of the intention. So in the future, the global economy is going to be far more bifurcated. It's going to separate into 2 different sections, the East and the West, very similar to what we saw when most of us were growing up with the Cold War. So on the left, we'll call it the East, we've got Russia, China, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, other countries. They're basically trading amongst one another. And on the right, we've got the West. They're doing the same. Call it USA and Europe. So the big takeaways from this video is that on the left in the East, we've got the commodities, very low cost. They're selling them at an extremely high price, and especially going back to that example that we used with coal. And in the West, they have a high need for commodities. They're not producing, or they'll produce far less in the future because of this movement towards ESG, but they'll have a high need for those commodities because of the Green New Deal and this electrification. They're going to have to pay an extremely high price, short term because they're not willing to buy from Russia, but long term because the only place they'll be able to get them, most likely, will be from the East, and the East can name their price. And in the future, Zoltan believes that in the West, we'll see far higher interest rates, much higher rates of inflation. And let's remember, in countries like the United States, Europe, and Japan, it's almost impossible for them to raise nominal rates at the front end of the curve, or Fed funds, a central bank, in other words, to raise the rate to a level where it would be higher than the rate of inflation. In other words, it's almost impossible for these countries in the West to have positive real interest rates. And he compares that with the East, where moving forward, although they might not have them now, they'll have more normalized interest rates, called 5-6%, and they'll have low levels of inflation for the reasons we discussed in step number 2. But let's not forget that even if they do have inflation, they have the ability to raise interest rates to almost any level. And we see that playing out right now in Russia, where the central bank has raised interest rates to 20% to prop up the ruble. Just think what would happen if the United States had to raise interest rates to 20% just to prop up the dollar. And just to be clear, when Zoltan's talking about high interest rates, he's talking about the rates at the long end of the curve and the rates in the real economy that you have to pay for mortgages, credit card debt, your car loan, etc. And when he's talking about the inability to raise rates, that's at the front end of the curve with the overnight rate that the Federal Reserve sets. Another point Zoltan was making that would lead to much, much higher interest rates in the real economy for mortgages, credit card debt, auto loans, etc., is this idea that we're going to have mass quantitative tightening. In the United States, we think of quantitative tightening just being a result of the Fed reducing the size of their balance sheet, or not buying the same amount of treasuries, mortgage-backed securities in the future, letting those run off their balance sheet. They're not rolling over the debt, or they're actually selling those treasuries or mortgage-backed securities into the market. But Zoltan believes that the global central banks will do the same thing when they are deciding to de-dollarize and hold fewer dollars, i.e. treasuries, on their balance sheet as reserve assets. So we could go into this environment where the Fed is trying to do quantitative tightening, but basically all the other central banks are doing it at the same time. Well, that means far lower demand for treasuries, which would mean the price goes down, the interest rate goes way up. Another thing he mentioned in the future, that he sees gold going much, much higher along with commodities, and basically most of the power moving to the east. We go from this environment where it's my currency, your problem, to it's my commodity and your problem. Therefore, whomever holds the cheap commodities is going to hold the majority of the global power, especially if the West remains unwilling to use the resources, energy, and commodities they have at their disposal. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.